Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive with us.
Thanks for having me.
Today we're looking at how academics share their research.
Yeah.
Trying to make it more relevant to the people out there actually working in those fields.
Yeah, bridging that gap between research and practice can be tough.
It really can. So the jumping off point for this deep dive is a paper. It's titled Customer-Centric Science, Reporting Significant Research Results with Rigor, Relevance, and Practical Impact in Mind. Quite a mouthful. It's by Herman Aguinis. And that rhymes with beer, by the way.
Oh, good to know.
Aguinis and his team.
Yeah.
Steve Werner,
Mm.
Jan Alanza Abbott, Corey Engert, Jun Hung Park, and Donna Kohlhausen. They make a really interesting argument that the traditional focus on statistical significance, it's just not enough.
Yeah, I could see that.
And they propose this three-step approach to make research findings more useful and impactful.
Okay, I like it.
So let's just jump right in. Step one.
Okay.
What is it?
So step one is all about moving beyond what they call the .05 dogma. You know, that laser focus on whether a p-value is less than .05?
Right, the magical p-value.
Exactly. For decades, that's been like the gold standard for saying, okay, this is a legit finding.
Right.
This is statistically significant.
But this paper is saying the cutoff is kind of arbitrary.
Exactly. Aguinis and his team, they point out how this .05 threshold came about. Partly from a rivalry between statisticians, like literally one of them, Fisher. He didn't have access to tables for other significance levels.
So we're basing like huge decisions about science on what sounds like a historical feud.
Yeah, it really shows how dangerous it can be to just cling to tradition without really thinking about why we're doing it.
Right.
And get this, they found that 99%
Right.
of management articles still rely on this arbitrary .05 cutoff, more than other business fields.
Wow. That's a lot of research potentially being judged by a standard that's just
Well, as you said. Yeah.
based on a historical quirk.
Yeah.
So what do they propose instead?
Okay, so instead of blindly following that .05 rule, they want researchers to think about the consequences of different kinds of errors. They call them type I and type 2 errors. A type I error is a false positive, like saying there's an effect when there really isn't, and
Yeah.
type 2 is a false negative. So missing a real effect that's actually there.
So it's like false alarms versus missed opportunities.
Yeah.
I guess the severity of those consequences should determine how strict our standards are, not just this random number.
Exactly. The paper gives this great example, contrasting a study on like CEO earnings manipulation. We're missing a real effect, a type 2 error. It would be disastrous
Oh, yeah.
with a study on knowledge sharing and inventions. We're a false positive, a type I error. Might just lead to wasted resources.
So the stakes should determine the level of certainty we need, not some one-size-fits-all number.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So what's step 2 in their customer-centric approach? Step 2 is all about effect size. So it's not enough to just prove like, okay, yeah, there's a relationship here. We also need to know how big it is. Just because something is statistically significant doesn't automatically mean it's practically meaningful.
Yeah. It's like, how there's a correlation between ice cream sales and sunburn,
Yeah.
but that doesn't mean one causes the other,
Right.
or that it's a strong enough relationship to really worry about.
Exactly. Aguinis and his team break down different ways to measure effect size, some focusing on the difference between groups, and others on how much one variable explains the variation in another.
Okay.
But here's the thing. They found that none of the top business journals even mention reporting effect size in their guidelines,
Really?
unlike psychology journals.
Huh. That's surprising. It seems like a pretty big oversight if we're trying to make research actually useful for real-world decisions. It would
Yeah.
be like having a map that shows you where the treasure is buried, but not how much treasure there is.
Yeah, great analogy. And that leads us to step 3 of their customer-centric framework, which really tackles this so what question head on.
Okay, let's hear it.
Step 3 is all about figuring out what these research findings actually mean for the people who would use them. Like, how do we bridge that gap between the statistical results and actually applying them?
This is what always gets me. I read so many studies and I'm like, okay, great, but what do I actually do with this information?
Exactly. And one of the big things this paper tackles is how we oversimplify effect sizes. Like
Yeah.
just slapping a label on something and saying, oh, this is a small effect, or this is a medium effect, or this is a large effect. It's just not enough.
Right?
Those labels are often based on these arbitrary benchmarks, and they don't consider the specific situation at all.
So even if we know how strong a relationship is, we still need to understand what it means in a particular context.
Exactly. Aguin and his co-authors even point out that Cohen's famous benchmarks for effect size, which everyone uses. They're partially based on data from a psychology journal that's over 4 years old.
Wow.
And part of it is literally just his opinion.
So much for objective standards. It sounds like we really need to move beyond these general labels and actually dig deeper into what the findings mean for people on the ground. So how do they suggest we do that?
Their solution is to bring in qualitative research methods. They want practitioners to be directly involved in interpreting the findings.
So instead of researchers just handing down conclusions from on high, why not get the people who will actually be using the information involved?
Exactly. Imagine presenting your initial findings to practitioners and getting their feedback. It could lead to whole new research questions.
Right.
Or even totally different interpretations of the data.
It becomes a two-way conversation. Researchers and practitioners learning from each other.
That's the beauty of the customer-centric approach. It's not just about publishing papers, it's about making sure the research is actually useful. Agwens and his team even suggest some specific methods for gathering this qualitative data. Things like ethnography, conversation analysis, narrative inquiry. Each one offers a different way to capture those practitioner perspectives.
Okay, this all sounds great in theory, but are there actually any studies out there using this customer-centric approach?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
And honestly, it's still early days. This paper is more of a call to action than a showcase of best practices. It's like laying the groundwork for a new way of doing things.
So we're on the frontier here, exploring a whole new landscape of research.
Exciting, but also maybe a little daunting. It sounds like both researchers and practitioners would need to change how they think.
Definitely. Researchers might need to get comfortable with giving up some control, and practitioners might need to become more active participants.
Right.
But if we can shift the focus from just generating knowledge to generating knowledge that's actually usable, the potential benefits are huge. It makes you wonder how much good research is just sitting on a shelf somewhere, because it never made that leap from the lab to the real world. Okay, so we've explored these 3 steps of customer-centric science. It's definitely given me a lot to think about. But for our listeners out there, how can they actually use this in their own lives? What's the takeaway? So we've been talking about this whole idea of customer-centric science and how it can help connect research with what people are actually doing out there. What really jumps out at you about this approach?
You know what I find really fascinating? Is that it really makes us rethink why we even do our research in the first place. It's like a reminder that knowledge for knowledge's sake isn't enough. We need to be asking, like, who is this for? How can they actually use it? What impact can it have out in the real world?
It's like getting out of the ivory tower.
Yeah.
Making sure research is actually relevant and useful to the people who can use it.
Exactly. It's about letting practitioners be a real part of the research process, not just sitting back and waiting for the results.
So instead of waiting for some researcher to tell them what's what, they can actually help shape the research questions, help figure out what the data means, and even push for changes based on the findings.
Yeah, it becomes a team effort.
I like that.
And you know, if we think bigger picture for a second, imagine what could happen if research was always turned into something actionable, something that could make things better in workplaces, communities, even globally.
Wow.
Think of how many problems we could solve if research and practice were truly in sync.
That's a powerful thought.
Yeah.
But it all starts with us, right? With demanding more from the research we read and the research we do ourselves.
Absolutely. We got to be critical thinkers, question our assumptions, consider different points of view.
So here's a challenge for all you deep divers out there. The next time you come across some research article or report, don't just take it for granted. Ask yourself, what's the effect size? Does it actually mean anything in practice? Were practitioners even involved? And how can I use this in my work or my life?
And if you're doing the research yourself, think about how you can use this customer-centric approach. How can you make your work more relevant, more impactful, more in line with what people actually need?
Yeah, we got to move past that old publish or perish mentality and get into this new era of research that actually makes a difference.
I'm all for that.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into customer-centric science. We hope you came away with some good insights and a new appreciation for what research can do. Until next time, keep diving deep.